If I think about Brian McLaren and kind of generous orthodoxy,
Yeah.
there's this kind of I'm too cool for school. I've got the secret knowledge. It's something that we're reintroducing. It's our interpretation, and if you're not with it, you're old fashioned. You're out of date. And as a historian, I just know how things go out of fashion so fast. Something that's a cool idea now, in 50 years' time, people are going to say, "What were you thinking?" There's kind of cultural snobbery as well, or historical snobbery, that we've got it all together. But, I agree with you. I love the historical continuity of Christianity. And these old ideas have stood the test of time because they are good ideas, and I would suggest are truthful ideas. And as soon as someone says, I've got a radical reinterpretation, or here's a subtle reinterpretation of this, that's a warning to me, because I think there's nothing new under the sun that
Mhm.
hasn't, in fact, been dealt with probably by the early church fathers and by others all the way down through 2,000 years. So you mean to tell me that after 2,000 years of some of the greatest minds in human history, you've come up with a bona fide, authentic revelation on an interpretation? I'm not saying I'm going to reject it straight away, but I already have my doubts about it.
Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to the show. I'm Alisa Childers. This is the Alisa Childers Podcast. It's our goal to equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And I'm very excited to bring you this conversation that I had with Dr. Adam Claasen. He is a historian that I met last year when I was in New Zealand, and he was so impressive. I loved getting to talk to him. And today we're going to talk all about the so-called lost gospels. We're going to talk about the biblical gospels. Were they written by eyewitnesses? What evidence do we have? Great conversation. Can't wait to bring that to you. Want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by SPERO Natural Goods. This is a Christian-owned body care company where they use the best possible natural ingredients, ethically sourced, skin-loving ingredients for body creams, soaps, all sorts of deodorants and skincare. Got to check them out at SPERONaturalGoods.com. That's spelled SPERO, naturalgoods.com. Use my code Alisa for 10% off any order. So this episode that I recorded with Dr. Adam Claasen was sort of the result of a Q&A that we both took a part in at the apologetics conference that we were doing there, where a very kind of hostile and skeptical person didn't really so much ask a question, but made some statements about Jesus actually maybe never even existed, and how do we even know that? And the gospel accounts that we have are just some of many that were lost and discarded, and the ones that we do have weren't written by eyewitnesses. There were just a lot of claims that went on, and Dr. Adam Claasen did such a beautiful job answering those questions that I wanted to have him on the podcast to share his expertise and help maybe some of you who might have some of these questions. I know that back when I was very challenged in what I believed over 10 years ago in a progressive church, this was a question that was discussed quite a bit, the so-called gnostic gospels. I think that was somewhere around the time that the book, the DaVinci Code, came out. And I think a lot of people were kind of confused about how we got the Gospels and how we know that we have the right books of the Bible, and were they written by eyewitnesses, or were there other books that were suppressed by the church, and all of those questions that are wrapped up in that topic. So without any further ado, I'll take you to my conversation with Dr. Adam Claasen. Well, Adam, I'm so glad to have you on the podcast. We met in New Zealand. I was there with Greg Kokel, and we were doing various apologetics events on weekends. And in one of those events, you were one of the speakers, and we were all on a panel. And I just want to share my perspective on this, and then you can share yours. But I had not even met you by the time we got up to the panel, because our sessions were at different times. And so somebody got up, and it was a pretty hostile question. This person was obviously not a believer. They had come to the conference to kind of give us a gotcha question in the Q&A. And the nature of the question had to do with the historical Jesus, and then also like these gnostic gospels, and how do we know that the New Testament is the right books, and all of this. And the nature of his question was right in just the heart of what my initial faith struggle was about over 15 years ago. And I remember thinking, okay, I don't know if I'm going to be the one that has to answer this question, but I was like thinking in my mind, well, then Adam opens his mouth and your answer was so good. And I remember thinking, he is so coming on the podcast. So you're probably unknown to, I would say, virtually all of my audience, especially in the States. Now, those that follow from New Zealand, they're probably like, yes, we got Adam on. But for those who are stateside and may not be familiar with you, tell us about you and about what you do. And then what we're going to do is kind of attack this question because it's also relevant from some things that have been going on in pop culture too. So, Adam, who are you and what do you do?
Well, I love being here, Alisa. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a historian here in New Zealand, and I did my PhD here. I work as an academic, mostly in the kind of area of the 20th century, First, Second World Wars, Cold War, teach a little bit on American foreign policy across the 20th century from the Spanish-American War of 1898 up until the present day. And then I also have done a bit of German history, and I teach principally courses on the Second World War and, have postgraduate students and all that sort of stuff. So that's my kind of vocation, my academic side of things. The other side of me is I am a born-again Christian. I got saved when I was 18 years of age, I guess, in a little small town here in New Zealand at a Salvation Army. And it was a dramatic conversion. And ever since then, I've been interested not just only in my academic area of research, but outside of, what I do at work. I'm interested in Second Temple Judaism. I'm interested in first century Christianity. I teach church history, apologetics, biblical worldview, and have talked at numerous churches. If a pastor goes on sabbatical and they need someone to fill in for 4 weeks, I might do a series on God and science or Jesus and the temple, as some of the recent ones I've done, and including this kind of stuff around the Gospels and, did Jesus exist and that sort of thing. So I cover a broad range of materials, but I really love this kind of stuff. And yeah, we met at the conference Thinking Matters. Shout out to Rowan here.
That's right. Yeah.
Who does a great job in New Zealand and has been very impactful here. And when we were in that panel, that guy was pretty strong. And I remember he took the microphone, in fact, off the MC, and our MC wanted to get it back, and the guy said, "Hey, I don't have any questions. I just want to say something."
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, what he was saying was Jesus didn't exist.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons I was primed for this was, and we'll get to some of this a bit presently when we talk about Gnostic Gospels, etc., is I had a student many years ago in a class, and I was just talking about Jesus, and the student asked, "Well, did Jesus exist?" And I thought, this is a great question. A lot of historians just take it for granted. And I started to research and think about what, kind of the historical methodology. How do you determine as a historian? And those rules apply whether you're a specialist in the 20th century or a specialist in the Greco-Roman world. And and of course I discovered from the student eventually, I think that he'd pretty much probably got it from YouTube and online, and those kind of discussions. We've got people who don't know a lot about the subject, seeming to appear that they do have a knowledge, but it's usually wafer thin and it's not rooted in a historical methodology.
Yeah.
And so he asked a good question, and one of the things he said was, there's 60 gospels, something like that. And I thought, yeah, there are 60 gospels, but they're not all equal.
Right. Right.
And I think, but he didn't appreciate that. And hadn't really thought about it, and kind of assumed, I think that, and as many people do, well, if it's got the name gospel on it, it's equivalent to the canonical gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But in actual fact, the content of them are very different. But I do think it raises a question for lots of people: which should I believe?
Yeah.
And that came up, and that's what I'm interested in, is why these Gnostic texts, or missing gospels, or secret gospels as people call them, why are they so appealing?
Mm-hmm.
How are they used in popular culture and misused? And how do they compare to the New Testament gospels? And I don't know, but did you see the interview, the debate between Huff and
Yes.
Billy Carson, which really was at the heart of what they were
Right.
doing and talking about.
Yeah, well, no, so I didn't actually see the whole debate between Wes and Billy. I had never even heard of Billy Carson, but I did watch Wes Huff on Joe Rogan, and so I loosely followed the drama surrounding that debate, but I had never even heard of Billy Carson. I didn't realize he had all these followers and that he was making all these claims. So I've seen some excerpts from it, but I haven't watched the whole thing. I assume you did.
I did, and it was hard to watch, and in a way, I felt sorry for Billy Carson because he was talking outside of an area that he wasn't an expert in, and of course didn't have any formal academic training in. His kind of shtick, or the thing that he promotes, are the kind of emerald tablets, which are these kind of mystical documents based around an Egyptian deity, which is supposed to produce enlightenment, esoteric teaching. Carson's also into things like the astronaut visitation theory, that the Earth has been visited by aliens, these alien astronauts, etc. And this is how we account for large structures on the Earth and pre-existing ancient civilizations, etc. So he's kind of into that area. And one of the things he did in that interview, which he talked about two gospels, and it was really hard. As I say, it was hard to watch because Billy Carson talked about the gospel of Barnabas, and he said there's these other gospels, and they don't talk about the crucifixion of Jesus, and he said two of them are the gospel of Barnabas and the gospel of Jesus' wife. And of course, Wes is completely familiar with this stuff. I mean, he deals in Coptic, he knows the languages, he knows the history, he's doing his postgraduate studies in this area. And that's very different to somebody who's got a passing knowledge of these sorts of things. And as Wes pointed out, the Gospel of Barnabas is a forgery, and not just kind of an early forgery, but as a medieval forgery. And it comes from, because it's got elements of Dante's Inferno, which we know was published in the early part of the 14th century, so like 1315, around that period. So clearly it's not written by Barnabas. It's clearly later. And then it's got this kind of propagandist material in it from an Islamic perspective around, it criticizes Paul, says that Paul is terrible. It's got a synthesis of the Gospels, but it downplays and completely rejects that Jesus was God, that he certainly wasn't the Son of God, and that he got executed, and has Judas being executed in Jesus's place. And you can see these resonances here with the Islamic beliefs, which arise out of the 7th and 7th century. And, this is a recasting of the Gospels with this kind of Islamic bent. But Billy Carson didn't seem to even know that it was a forgery, and just, accepted it at face value.
Right.
Which indicates a lack of preparation for the debate. But then also the Gospel of Jesus' wife, and this much later, but also a forgery, and a well-known one. So that was promoted by Karen King, a theologian at Harvard University, in 2012. It comes out, it talks about, Jesus talks about a wife, and so, it's accepted as a very small fragment. The Gospel of Barnabas is much larger, and this is just a fragment. And so it was this idea of Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene. And the problem with it is, it was also a forgery. They were able to date the papyrus that it was written on from the medieval period. And in addition to that, we know the provenance now of that fragment, and it was as shady as could be. It was a guy who had been implicated in materials going missing in a museum in Berlin. He'd been other kinds of accusations around this area. And then by 2017, even Karen King, who really wanted it to be the Gospel of Jesus's wife, as a Coptic text, hopefully from the 4th century at the latest, she even had to admit that it wasn't. And so it really started off bad. The whole thing started off badly for Billy Carson, but he gravitated towards it. And I think this raised an interesting question: why do people gravitate towards these sorts of texts? I mean, have you thought about it when you were experienced?
Every morning, I look forward to my first cup of coffee. It's like a ritual for me. I go over to my espresso machine, I make an Americano, and I've been reading recently about how there is mold sometimes that can grow in certain coffee beans if they're not stored properly. This can lead to some health issues. Well, this is just one of the many, many, many reasons that I love 7 Weeks Coffee, because not only is their coffee shade-grown, low acid, mold-free, and organically farmed, it's run by Christians who are unapologetically pro-life. So I love that every time I have a cup of 7 Weeks Coffee, I know that I'm supporting pregnancy care centers all across the country, because 7 Weeks Coffee is America's pro-life coffee company, and they're on a mission to fund the pro-life movement 1 cup of coffee at a time. This is why they give 10% of every sale to pro-life centers all across the country. They've raised over $1 million, saved thousands of lives, and you can be a part of that when you subscribe to the Heartbeat Club. I get my espresso beans through 7 Weeks Coffee every single month. I get a pound, and I'm so excited when that arrives in the mail. I've even used pounds of 7 Weeks Coffee as a host gift. If I'm invited over to someone's house, it's the perfect thing to bring to the person who's invited you over. And so here's what you need to do. Go to 7weekscoffee.com and subscribe. When you subscribe, you're going to save 15% forever. That's on every single order. But if you also use my code Alisa, you're going to get an additional 10% off your first order. So go to 7weekscoffee.com, use my code Alisa for up to 25% off your first order plus your free gift. 7weekscoffee.com, use my code Alisa. Well, so back almost 15 years ago, when I was in a kind of hostile situation, I would say theologically hostile, in that it was a progressive church that I didn't know was progressive yet. This is part of my testimony. This pastor who was sort of facilitating the study group was already deconstructed. He had become a progressive Christian. And so he was really sort of systematically undermining the historic Christian worldview. And one of the ways that he did that was to get us to really question the Bible and the historicity of the text, and the people that we think wrote it, did they really write it? And part of that conversation, well, there were two pillars that I think about as I'm listening to you talk. The number one was the existence of Jesus, because I remember I don't know if it was the pastor or somebody else in the class, they had said, well, have you ever thought about the fact that there's no other writings about Jesus except the Bible? And so that got me on a research trail where I was like, well, is that true? And then, of course, I discovered that you have not tons, but you've got, within about 150 years of Jesus' life, you've got about 10 at least non-Christian, even hostile sources that mention Jesus as a real person within that time frame of his life. But the other side of that coin was that everybody in this class was really enamored with Gnostic Gospels. So they were talking about, the Gospel of Thomas. That one, we discussed that one a lot. And I remember, I wrote about this in my first book. I remember going home, because a lot of this is accessible online. You can read the Gospel of Thomas online. Mm-hmm. You can read some of these Gnostic Gospels online. And I was reading through the Gospel of Thomas, and I remember just thinking, okay, I had no knowledge of the textual, manuscript copying or any of that, how that would relate with all of this. But I'm just looking at it as a layperson going, this is describing two totally different people. Like, there's the Jesus of the Gospels, and then there's the Jesus that we find in the Gospel of Thomas, who's a totally different person, different personality. And he really struck me as someone who was kind of arrogant and deceitful. Like, the real Jesus was subversive in a certain way with certain things, but this was like deceitful and petty almost, the Jesus that I found in there. So that led me to do not obviously an academic deep dive, but a deeper dive into what we're talking about when we're talking about the Gnostic Gospels. And then I've seen since that time the popularity of conflating the Gnostic Gospels with the biblical Gospels has just exploded in popularity. And of course, I didn't even know who Billy Carson was, but people like him. And in fact, I just responded on my Instagram to a woman who was basically saying the Bible is just a copy of ancient, other ancient writings. And of course, that had to do more with the creation myths and the flood story and things like that, which that also came up with Joe Rogan and Wes Huff. But I guess where we could start as far as discussing these secret gospels, they're sometimes called, or the lost gospels, they're sometimes called. What are we talking about when we say these, secret gospels. And what would you say are the main differences? Like, one difference that I'd love to ask you about is even the textual criticism aspect of it. Because when you think about the New Testament, you have lots of copies, early copies. But with some of these Gnostic gospels, it's my understanding, like with Gospel of Thomas, we really only have like 4 copies. Is that right?
That's not my area, the textual criticism, but we do have early writers. If you think about Irenaeus, Polycarp, other gospels are starting to be mentioned in the 2nd century. And of course, the biggest find for these gospels was the Nag Hammadi collection and library found in Egypt in the 1940s. And a lot of these gospels, like the Gospel of Philip, find their home in this collection. So that was an amazing archaeological find. And they're really great for telling us about Gnosticism in the 2nd, 3rd, maybe 4th centuries. But from a historical perspective, they actually don't have a lot to offer about Jesus in the 1st century, other than clearly they want to attach themselves to somebody who is well known and carries a lot of gravitas, or as we would say in New Zealand, mana, a lot of weight. So, of course, the Gnostics take their beliefs, which are quite different to the Christian beliefs, Judeo-Christian beliefs. So Gnosticism is a very complex area, but if we could simplify it down to a kind of a dualistic belief in that the material world is bad, it's corrupt, and it's impure. The spiritual realm is good, it's pure, it's uncorrupted, and that the God of the Hebrews created this world. And because it's bad, he's evil, he's capricious, and he has trapped the kind of divine spark of humanity in these corrupted bodies. And what we need is freedom from that. And one of the ways we can get that is through secret gnosos, or knowledge, where this idea of Gnostic gospel comes from. And so Jesus is co-opted into the Gnostic narrative as one of these revealers of secret knowledge. So they're not really interested in the crucifixion of Jesus. They're not interested in the kind of purpose that is very clearly laid out in the Bible, where it says in John's gospel that God sent his only begotten son. And then it goes on to say, to save the world. Well, the world doesn't need saving in Gnosticism because the world's evil, and people are trapped in this world. So there's a real strong difference between the kind of message you're getting from the Gnostic Gospels and from the canonical Gospels. I think the kind of popularity of this, like if I could say there's a popularity to this, it's one is people who aren't Christians, some of them, they really love a kind of a stick to beat Christianity over the head with. And the Gnostic Gospels is kind of one of those things. And if people are ignorant about when they're written and what they contain and how different they are to the Gospels, they readily believe this. I think also the idea that they're secret. If I was to tell one of my kids when they were younger, hey, I've got a secret, and I did it in front of all the other children, the others would really want to try and get that secret out of their sibling. And I think in human nature, we're the same. I mean, if you said you had some kind of secret, I would really want to know what it is. I think there's something in human nature to search for secrets, and that's what these Gnostic Gospels purport to offer. Mm-hmm. And then, but I also think that there's a reaction against materialism, that the materialism of the rejection of Christianity had to be replaced with something. And nihilism is a very unsatisfactory philosophical position to have. Mm-hmm. And because I think we are made in God's image, we have a natural desire to seek for eternity and something that transcended and is beyond ourselves. So if you're going to reject Christianity as that, you're going to try and find it somewhere else. Yeah. And I think the secret gospels is that kind of yearning for something. And, maybe even you could say Billy Carson's emphasis on these emerald tablets and the gospel of Barnabas and the gospel of Jesus's wife is an expression of that. And I think that's one of the reasons why, this became very public, and I think this was probably where it became the most prominent with the DaVinci Code. Do you remember when that came out?
Oh, I read the DaVinci Code back when it was long before the movie, but I read the book, and I remember reading the book And my heart was like racing, and I was thinking, this can't be right. Like, this can't be right. And it didn't really rattle me all that much because I knew it was fiction. But I didn't realize also how seriously people were taking the book. And I want to talk about that because there's also some misconceptions about what even happened at the Council of Nicaea based on, I think, what the DaVinci Code teaches. But before we get there, I want to just hang back on Gnosticism just a little bit because I'm curious to get your opinion on this. I recorded another episode that's probably already been released. So my audience will probably have already heard this, where I did a progressive Christian sermon review with the Honest Youth Pastor, who he does that on his channel. And I didn't say this in the episode, but I was thinking it, and I'm thinking it a lot now. And it's like so much of progressive theology really is very Gnostic in nature, because the whole point of this guy's sermon was he was teaching about the parable of the wedding feast, and he did this radical reinterpretation of the parable of the wedding feast to make the king isn't God, the king is empire, and then the person who doesn't have the wedding clothes on and gets thrown out where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth, he said that's actually Jesus, who's refusing to cooperate with empire. And I'm thinking, and at one point in the episode, I was like, it's just stunning to me how this guy would say that there's been a very particular way that the church has interpreted this parable for 2,000 years, but he's got the secret knowledge to say, no, everybody before me has misunderstood. I've got it right. Here's what the real thing is. And it's like, that's what's so hard about it for me to buy. And even in the deconstruction movement, there's a very Gnostic element, I think, to deconstruction as well, because the premise that so many people deconstruct on is, hey, there is this stuff the church has been keeping from you, but we're the ones who are finally going to tell you the truth. And so in a way, I know they're not saying it's secret knowledge, but it almost operates in that way. Do you find that to be the same, or am I off base here?
No, I think you're right on the money. If I think about Brian McLaren and kind of generous orthodoxy,
Yeah.
there's this kind of I'm too cool for school. I've got the secret knowledge. It's something that we're reintroducing. It's our interpretation. And if you're not with it, you're old fashioned. You're out of date. And as a historian, I just know how things go out of fashion so fast. Something that's a cool idea now, in 50 years' time, people are going to say, what were you thinking? There's kind of cultural snobbery as well, or historical snobbery, that we've got it all together. But, I agree with you. I love the historical continuity of Christianity. And these old ideas have stood the test of time because they are good ideas, and I would suggest are truthful ideas. And as soon as someone says, I've got a radical reinterpretation, or here's a subtle reinterpretation of this, that's a warning to me, because I think there's nothing new under the sun that
Mm-hmm.
hasn't, in fact, been dealt with probably by the early church fathers and by others all the way down through 2,000 years. So you mean to tell me that after 2,000 years of some of the greatest minds in human history, you've come up with a bona fide, authentic revelation on an interpretation? I'm not saying I'm going to reject it straight away, but I already have my doubts about it.
I know there are so many Christian parents out there that want to give your kids a strong biblical foundation, but maybe you don't know where to start. I always recommend Foundation Worldview curriculum. This is a curriculum that we have used in our homeschool. So if you have kids that are between the ages 4 and 12, this is my number one recommendation to give your kids a biblical foundation. They have lots of different types of curriculums. They have a worldview curriculum. They have a critical thinking curriculum, how to study the Bible, biblical sexuality. They have everything you need as a parent to help you equip your kids to be able to stand strong in this culture that has become really quite hostile to Christian beliefs. So these curriculums will help your kids spot false ideas. It's really easy for parents. You just print the lessons, watch the video. There's all sorts of creative ways that they engage your kids, creative art and all sorts of things to help get those messages deep into their hearts. So whether you have a preschooler, an elementary student, or a preteen, Foundation Worldview has a curriculum designed for their developmental stage. And they're going to cover, like I said, biblical thinking, biblical literacy, and God's good design for sexuality. So today, go to foundationworldview.com, use my code Alisa for 10% off of any family license. Foundationworldview.com, use my code Alisa. Yeah, that's good. All right, so let's talk about DaVinci Code because this was very influential. I still see people sharing talking points, whether it be TikTok theology or whatever it might be, that were really promoted by that book and ultimately by that movie. So, of course, the movie or the book and the movie taught that Jesus had a wife, right? And that there was even questions about his divinity. So talk about that, like the influence you think that had in culture, because it was a big influence.
It's hard to believe now because, as you say, it was a fiction book. It was sold in the fiction section of a bookstore. But people became almost disciples of it. I remember being in Washington, D.C. in 2006, and I was teaching there at a university in D.C. And one of my students worked in like Barnes and Noble, or Borders bookstore. And, after class, I was just chatting with him. And he was talking about the people that came in to buy the book or were interested in the book. And he said they had that kind of devotee look about them, and that they really believed that they were learning some secret knowledge by reading the book. So there was that element of Gnosticism here. And of course, the story is a murder mystery, and it is fast paced. So it's a good summer relaxing read if you don't take history too seriously. And you got Robert Langdon and Sophie Nevers. They're in Paris. There's a murder in the Louvre, and then they try and break down a code around a painting by Leonardo da Vinci, and another one's going to appear, The Last Supper, later with a secret message Leonardo's put in it. They travel around Europe, and there's this amazing cast. You've got Leonardo da Vinci, you've got Mary Magdalene, you've got Jesus Christ, you've got the Knights Templar, you've got the Priory of Zion, you've got Opus Dei. And the evil Catholic Church, according to the Gospel of Dan Brown, and it's just in all of this information, and Constantine, of course, how the Bible was created, all of that's covered there. And what he did was very clever: is he broke what we might call an unspoken rule in writing historical fiction or fiction that purports to have truth in it. And at the beginning of the book, before the story started, he said all the events and people and places are historically accurate. And I think when people read it, they took that at face value. It wasn't part of the fictional text. It was in the kind of preface to the book. And then when they read it, they were like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And of course, one of the big themes in the story is that we find out that the Holy Grail, and he had got this idea from another book, Holy Blood and Holy Grail, that had previously been published, that the Holy Grail wasn't this chalice from Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade, but it was the womb, I know this sounds strange, but the womb of Mary Magdalene. And that Jesus and Mary had married, they'd consummated their marriage, they had offspring, and these offspring would become the Merovingian kings of France, and that their descendants were still alive today, but the Catholic Church was suppressing this because they were scared of something called the sacred feminine, and they had throughout their history maligned Mary Magdalene. And, it was, of course, completely bogus, and that the Catholic Church had tried to hide the Dead Sea Scrolls and all this sort of stuff, where in actual fact they've been heavy promoters of these archaeological finds. And, Mary Magdalene, far from being maligned in Catholic theology, she's elevated. I think she has her own day in the Catholic calendar. So it was all completely bogus, but people actually believed it. And the two things that he'd used from the Gnostic Gospels were the Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Philip. So the Gospel of Mary, a Coptic text, probably coming from around 180, 150. The Gospel of Philip from about 250. So the Gospel of Mary talks about Jesus being devoted to Mary and perhaps loving her more than the other disciples. And then we have the Gospel of Philip saying that perhaps he loved her more than all the other disciples, that she was his companion, which Dan Brown suggests refers to a marriage. But I think he gets the language wrong for that as well in the text. He doesn't know that it's written in Coptic. And then it says in broken text, in the original, that Jesus used to, that he would kiss her often on her mouth. Now, the word often and mouth have been inserted to the text because they are missing because of all these gaps in the text, because it's in such a poor condition. But what he doesn't see, so Dan Brown interprets all of this to support, this is the evidence he produces to support his claim, just as Billy Carson was trying to support his claim about Jesus not being crucified. And of course, neither of those gospels, even if you just take them at face value, say that they were married or that they had offspring. And he doesn't understand the kind of background ideas for the Gnostics, that the idea of a sexual union between Jesus and Mary Magdalene would be frowned upon and even be repugnant. Why would they produce children in which this divine spark is trapped? It just makes no sense whatsoever. And of course, the fact that we know that they weren't written by these two individuals. Mary was long dead and Philip was long dead. So they are, forgeries of the 2nd and the 3rd century, and they have this Gnostic meaning behind them. And they're very, as you pointed out, they're very different as you read the Gospel of Thomas from the canonical Gospels, which have a kind of biography framework with a historical narrative. The Gospel of Thomas, like many of these other Gnostic texts, are really collections of sayings, quite esoteric, quite poorly structured. And I think that, they'd help an insomniac to get some sleep, because they're actually quite hard to read and to say. The problem with the DaVinci Code was the book sold 80 million copies, translated into 40 languages. To put that in context, the Harry Potter collection, 250 million, the Dan Brown, Robert Langdon series, including Angels and Demons and the other one, it's 150 million. So this was a mega seller. Lots and lots of people read it. I remember when it came out, I would be, you'd be at an airport and you'd see people had hard copy books, long before Kindles and reading off your phones was super popular. And it seemed like every second book was the DaVinci Code.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the movie came out. Now, the interesting thing about all of this, Alisa, is that they did surveys. And in the United Kingdom, they ran a survey, and they found that 60% of people who had read the book believed that Jesus had married Mary Magdalene and had children, compared to 30% of the British population that hadn't read the book. And then in Canada, they found that 1 in 3 Canadians believed that they had had offspring, and they found that 1 in 4 people in France believed that there were descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene still alive today in the 21st century in France. So that is the kind of impact a book like this can have. But of course, as a historian knows, there is a vast difference between these in terms of wanting to know anything about the historical Jesus and what these Gnostic texts have to say.
Yeah. Well, okay, so as a historian then, when you're looking for information about the real historical Jesus, what do you think makes like the New Testament canonical Gospels more reliable than, say, some of these Gnostic Gospels? Because I think the attitude of a lot of people out there is sort of like, hey, there's all this information about Jesus. You have all the gospel. Well, and I've heard it said it was the theological winners that got to write the canonical Gospels, and they suppressed these other voices. And of course, that kind of falls apart when you look at the actual dating of the texts themselves. These Gnostic Gospels come later, and so what makes the New Testament Gospels superior as far as the information about Jesus to the Gnostic Gospels?
I think that what I often encourage my students to do with any kind of historical endeavor is set up a timeline, get out a piece of paper and a pen, and actually draw this out. So if we were to take the question of whether Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, and as a historian we want to answer that, we think about the evidence we have. Well, we do have the Gospel of Philip, say 250. We have the Gospel of Mary, 150. We have the canonical Gospels, perhaps as early as 50, but certainly 60, 70, 80, and 90 from the 1st century. Now, imagine you have a flux capacitor-powered DeLorean from Back to the Future. It's only got 3 settings. You can't change them. One of them is for 250, one of them is for 150, and the other is for 50. What is any historian who is worth their salt going to do when they get on the highway and they're about to get up to 88 miles per hour? Which of those 3 settings are they going to go? Are they going to go for the 3rd century, the 2nd century, or the 1st century to answer that question? It's a no-brainer. A historian is always going to go for 50. And why is that? The answer is real clear. it's because there are still eyewitnesses available. All the eyewitnesses are dead by the 3rd century. All the eyewitnesses are deceased by the 2nd century. And it's really only in the 1st century that we have this possibility of people writing anything meaningful based around the eyewitnesses. And of course, that's in fact what the Gospels and the writers of the New Testament claim. We've got Peter talking about this in his epistle, that, he's not following fables. We have Luke lays out, it's incredible, really. He lays out a methodology that is not completely dissimilar to a 21st century historian. What are you going to look for when you want to write about somebody, particularly when it's close to your own lifetime? Is you might ask yourself, are there eyewitnesses available? And Luke says, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to use eyewitnesses as my sources. And then, of course, we have the gospel, Luke's gospel as a result of that. Matthew himself, he's an apostle, he's a disciple. We have John, the beloved, he's a disciple. And then, of course, we've got Mark's gospel, which, we might talk about. But I just think in terms of timing, what are you going to do with that flux capacitor powered DeLorean? You're definitely going to go to that 1st century at 80, 50, because people are going to be alive. And, people did live longer than people generally accept today or think about, because there's this idea, a popular idea, of life expectancy in the 1st century being between 20 to 30 years of age. And there is some truth to that, but that's the average. And, what we do know is that people could live for as long as we live today. And so we've got people who've done research in the medieval period. They estimate that probably about 10% of the medieval population lived to their 70th birthday and beyond. Today, of course, it's a lot more than that. But in the medieval period, if you transpose those figures to the 1st century, which some scholars have done, because they say it's entirely credible, we've got people in the Roman Empire, if we say 10% of the Roman Empire's population lived to their 70th birthday and beyond, and the Roman Empire is 60 million people in the 1st century or thereabouts, that's 6 million people are living at least till their 70th birthday. Wow. If we take a place like Judea and that region in the 1st century, it's maybe as much as 600,000 people. So, we've got people in the 1st century, that's 60,000. Is that 60,000 people from 600,000? And then if we think about Jerusalem, in the time of Jesus, some of them historical demographers estimate perhaps 60,000 people in Jerusalem. So we've got 6,000 people in Jerusalem are going to live, who are born at any one time, are going to live at least to their 70th birthday. So a lot of people could live as long as us. So if you think about the Emperor Augustus, he's the emperor when Jesus is born. He lives to I think he's 77. He's replaced by Tiberius, who's the emperor during Jesus' lifetime. He's living to 79. We've got Cato the Elder living till he's 85. We know that Polycarp lived till he was 86 years old because he said that himself. And we have Cicero's wife, 103. So this idea, that these people, their lives are too short, we're getting all these generations before the Gospels are actually written, it's just not the case. And of course, if the disciples were particularly young, they could easily be around at the end of the 1st century. It's not an impossibility. So if John, who's traditionally believed to be quite young, even a teenager, but say we made him 20 at the year 30, how old is he when we get to the year 90? So if he's in his 70s, he's long lived, he can easily live longer, potentially live longer than that. So this idea, and I think this is where form criticism really is a real problem today, is that this idea of the eyewitnesses being still there when the Gospels are written is pretty strong. And there's no reason, it seems to me it's very, very reasonable.
So is that idea of, the lifespans being shorter, is that primarily where people are arguing from when they say that the Gospels were later developments and they weren't written by eyewitnesses, but they're more like legendary developments and people just use their names? Because I run into that a lot. When I talk about the Gospels as eyewitness testimony, people will say, nobody believes their eyewitness testimony. I mean, these were written much later. Is that argument about the lifespan one of the reasons they're saying that, or why are people claiming that?
Well, I just think if people accepted it, and they are claiming that. So they're saying, it was the first generation. Then they pass it on orally to the next generation, to another generation, and then across time we get, kind of what we call broken telephone, or some cultures it's called Chinese whispers, or it's that game where one person says something to somebody else. So at the beginning, they might say Adam's amazing, but by the time we get to 20 people, we've got Madam is crazy. And the Gospels have been transformed, or they've been transformed to meet different needs. But I don't think the needs of people change so radically over a 30-year period. I mean, if we're taking Peter's alive in the first, in the 30s, obviously. He lives until the 60s, where he's likely executed during the reign of Nero. We've got, so we've got the 40s, the 50s. We've got like at least two decades. He's still alive. And if John's living all the way through to the end of the first century, and I think the key thing here also to remember is that I think a lot of people only think of the apostles. There is a much bigger group of disciples out there. And this is showing up in a number of places in the New Testament. So we commonly think of the 12, but outside of those disciples, apostles, we have a whole range of other disciples. So I think it's a big surprise when for some people, we get to the book of Acts and they're trying to replace Judas. And then they say, hey, here are these two individuals, names we have not ever seen before, but they're not a surprise to the people who recommend them. In fact, the criteria for the person to replace Judas was that the person had to have been with them since the beginning, with John's baptism of Jesus until Jesus's ascension. So the two names that are mentioned are clearly well known by everybody. It's just that they're not. And of course, we've got the 70 being appointed and being commissioned to go and preach. And then we've got 500 people appearing in First Corinthians, that after Jesus is resurrected.
Yeah.
So, who are these people? So outside of the people that are named in the Gospels, there's this whole plethora of people that were witnesses that are also alive. So it's just not the testimony of a select few. And I think people don't really grasp that. And of course, I think we have good testimony from one of the early church fathers that kind of links the apostolic age through to the first century. And, that's Papias.
Yeah.
I mean, Polycarp is one. Quadrantus is another from Athens. But, Papias is one of these guys from Antioch, from Hierapolis, I should say, who, he's living in a region probably from 60 to 130. He writes a series of volumes. They're nearly all they're lost to us today, but extracts of them appear in Eusebius's history. And of course, he's one of these links between the apostolic age, and he's the one who's getting this he gets information on who wrote some of these Gospels. So when people say, well, the Gospels are not really attributed to certain apostles or writers until much later, the Muratorian fragment, for example. No. We have it quite early, this tradition, and I believe it goes back to the first century, because Papias says that he gets this information about who the authors were of these canonical Gospels from the followers of the disciples of Jesus. And so there's this kind of direct apostolic link that I feel needs to be taken a lot more seriously there. So he's using Astrion and a guy called John the Elder. Now, Astrion we've never heard of, but that shouldn't surprise us. There's a whole range of disciples we haven't heard of. that are followers of Jesus. Some of them are going to be itinerant followers. Some of them are going to be semi-itinerant, and some are going to be domiciled followers. People who just live in their homes, and Jesus sometimes comes and stays with them. You think about Lazarus's family; they're obviously disciples, but they're not a part of this traveling caravan, which I think, in many occasions, is more than the 12, and clearly is more than the 12. So there's this range of people that are still alive across this period.
Yeah. Well, and I don't want to crack open a whole new can of worms, because we're going to have you come back for another episode to talk really specifically about the Gospel of Mark and just the internal evidence with Mark's Gospel. But I was going to ask you, isn't Papias who lets us know that Mark is actually Peter's Gospel, right? He's sort of acting as is it like more acting like a scribe for Peter? Or give us just I don't want to get too deep, because I know we're going to come back and do a whole episode on Mark, but give us this thumbnail sketch of just the arguments that you would make to argue for the reliability of the canonical Gospels over the Gnostics just using Mark.
Well, this whole idea of Papias and his importance, this has really been rekindled in the historiography and in discussions around the New Testament by a guy called Richard Bauckham, an amazing academic, been at Cambridge, and he's written, I think, maybe 20 books. And, he's really brought to the forefront of this kind of scholarship, and really has thrown a hand grenade, a scholarly hand grenade in amongst this discussion. And, what we've got with Papias, he's saying that he living in Hierapolis, where Philip was for a while. Certainly his daughters were there. It's a crossroads. It's the kind of the region of the book of Revelation, those churches, that disciples would come through there, but also the disciples of the disciples, people who were followers of particular disciples would turn up, and he would question them and ask them. And so he asked this guy, John the Elder. So he's not John the Beloved, the son of Zebedee, but he's another John. And this John, the disciple of this John the Elder, says that in Mark's capacity as Peter's interpreter, he wrote down accurately as many things as Peter recalled from memory. And it was his one concern not to admit anything or falsify anything. So that, and the way that it's worded is that our man says, Papias says, there's all these other disciples. From their followers, I got information, but by implication, they're already dead by the time he hears it from those disciples. But Astrion and John the Elder, he uses the present tense. This is what they are saying now, and I've heard it from their followers, and they say that Mark's gospel was written by Mark, and it was based on Peter's testimony. And, we could open this up on another occasion. But I think the internal evidence and external evidence for, Mark being the writer of this gospel and, it being based on an eyewitness, Peter, is really, really strong.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what would that do to the Gospel of Mark? It would help date it, because we know that Peter, he's dead. He dies in the 60s. And we also know when Mark traveled a lot with Peter. And that kind of helps us with the dating, that it's early and it's based on eyewitness accounts.
Yeah. And so let's circle back around to the guy who asked the question. Well, you're right. He didn't really ask a question. He just had some things to say about how he didn't think Jesus, really existed, and then all of these resources that we're using them erroneously. He even, kind of brought up the Josephus quote that there was some additions to that, but I've done actually a couple of episodes with some New Testament scholars on that. And, it's not, and I think you would probably agree with this, because I heard you say this from the stage that day, is that, yes, we acknowledge that there were some additions later that people added to that Josephus quote, but it is a legitimate mention of the historical person of Jesus. That part has never really been debated about that quote. So maybe as we close out this episode, this is all so fascinating, but I'm thinking the average Christian probably doesn't have the mental bandwidth to go down these rabbit trails. They're not academics. They might tune in for our episode on Mark to kind of get all of those arguments as it surrounds Mark's gospel. But when just the average person is online and they're trying to share the gospel with people, and somebody says, well, maybe Jesus didn't even really exist, but if he did, we don't have any accurate testimony. We certainly don't have eyewitness testimony. What would be just maybe a short answer that somebody could give that isn't going to be able to do the deep dive that you have done as an academic?
Yeah. My honest answer would be, read a book.
Yeah, right. I know. That's true.
I mean, find someone who's actually got a qualification in the area,
Yeah.
that they're not self-taught. And I think Wes really this was the real, how Billy got shown up, and how lots of people get shown up in this area, that there is something serious about how you do the business of history, and that there are particular methodologies which help you decide whether something is worth listening to in answer to a particular question over other sources. And that's what I would be suggesting. I mean, the book I would suggest for the Gnostic Gospels, and this kind of idea whether Orthodox Christianity was just one of a whole series in the first century and it was the one that won this battle or not, or whether that orthodoxy was right from the beginning, it was the strongest, and then we get these fractions or factions breaking off later and different kinds of developments arising. I mean, the book for that, I've got The Missing Gospels by Darrell Bock. I don't know if you've read this book, but that's
Not read that one.
It's an excellent primer on this subject from a good Christian scholar, very solid. Of course, he's well known for his commentaries on Luke. I don't know if you see, he's got his 2 volumes, but that's a legendary set. So I would look at Darrell Bock on that subject, and I would be thinking about Richard Baucham's book. I mean, the other one, of course, is Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter J. Williams. Is an excellent introductory primer that would get people on the right path. And I often feel reading a book is so much better than going online, because, and I find this with students, and we know this from studies just in basic pedagogy, that when you're trying to learn something on a screen that is connected to the internet, your ability to retain material and actually learn anything properly is severely diminished. Of course, here we are on a screen, we are disseminating ideas. And of course, that's useful. But to embed something, once you're introduced to an idea, and I hear a new idea, I think, okay, I need a book on that to kind of solidify it and get it into my mind, so I can understand it more fully, so I can create a good defense. Because when you're online, what happens? An email arrives. You're tempted to play on chess.com. Right. You're tempted to play solitaire. You've got all kinds of notifications coming in if you haven't stopped that already. And so your thinking becomes fragmented, and then you're thinking, I don't really understand this. The material might be good, but you don't understand, and it's fragmented because of the environment you're learning the material in. It is fragmented, and it's designed to perpetually distract you with a cornucopia of entertainments.
Distractions,
and I struggle with that. Everyone struggles with that, I think.
Yeah, we sure do.
So that's what I would recommend. And that's the book I would say. And, the Can We Trust the Gospels? And, of course, Lee Strobel. I mean, I've had people, I remember one time I was in an appliance store. I don't know if you use that term in the States, but, a place that sells TV and technology. And I was just chatting to a guy, and he discovered that I do apologetics and Christian talks and things. And, he wanted to know more. I don't know whether he was just being polite as a salesperson. And I thought, you know what? I've only got a certain amount of time here. But when I went away, I went down to the local bookstore, bought a copy of The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, took it back to the appliance, and I said, hey, read. He wasn't there. I said, this is for this guy, for him to read. And so I think, Lee Strobel's excellent.
Yeah. In fact, I'm looking up the name of Lee Strobel's book on this topic. Was the first one I read. I think it's called is it The Case for Jesus, maybe? Or I'm trying to look it up.
Christ.
The Case for the Real Jesus. Well, Case for Christ is his story, and that's his big apologetics book. But The Case for the Real Jesus deals directly with the historical Jesus and the arguments against that. And that was the first one that I read on this topic. And I would just add to what you're saying. I think there's a lot of value in what you're saying, because if somebody's online and they're sharing the Christian faith and somebody makes a claim like that, if you even choose to engage a claim like that, a great thing to do is to do some investigation to see how serious the person is who's even making the claim, because you don't even have to be a scholar and know all the answers to be able to engage. But you could even, this is what our friend Frank Turek does. He'll say to somebody, if they're just being particularly combative in a Q&A or something, he'll say, if I gave you a book, would you read it? And it's very interesting, people's responses, because even if you don't know the answer, my advice would even be to say, to the person, like, how serious is this inquiry? If you're really searching for truth, will you read this book with me? We can read it together and we can discuss it. Because I find that a lot of people are not really looking for information. They're not really seeking truth. They're kind of just trying to maybe justify the unbelief that's already there. And so even if you as a person don't feel, because I'm not a scholar, I'm a layperson, I appeal to scholars a lot. I will quote scholars to make my case. But I think I appreciate what you're saying there. And I'm so thankful for scholars for that reason, because we can have these authoritative voices that have access to all the information that maybe we haven't been able to go through, and they can, give us their analysis, and then we can appeal to those scholars. And there's scholars on either side of things, but that can be a good way to sort things as well. I wanted to ask you real quick before we close out, have you read Michael Kruger's, and it's Kostenberger and Kruger, The Heresy of Orthodoxy?
No, I don't believe I have.
Okay, that's another,
Would you
it's
recommend
short.
it?
I would, yes. It's kind of like how you recommended Peter Williams' book, Can We Trust the Gospels, which is, like you said, such a great primer. We've had him on the show to talk about that. But The Heresy of Orthodoxy is just, it's tiny. It's a scholarly work, but it's short, very, very accessible. And it's primarily dealing with that claim that early Christianity was so diverse, theologically diverse, and it was the theological winners, the Bauer hypothesis, essentially, is what that book deals with. It's academic, but it's understandable for the layperson. So that might be another book that I would recommend in this space. And of course, you recommended to me when I met you the Bauckham book, what is it called? The Eyewitnesses.
Jesus and the Eyewitnesses.
Yes, I have that on my Kindle now. I've started that. So those are all such great resources. Yeah, those are all great resources for people. And of course, tune back in. We're going to have Adam back on to talk more specifically about the Gospel of Mark. I'm excited for that. Any final words for us today, Adam?
No, I've really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I loved it. Well, I want to thank my guest, Adam Claasen, and get some of those resources, and especially get Can We Trust the Gospels and The Heresy of Orthodoxy, short little books that will really give you they're just jam-packed with information. So get those if you want to be able to have these discussions with people and share some of this information. And let's remember, as we pursue Christ, to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.